In the autumn of 1823, the air in rural Ohio carried a strange heaviness, the kind that clings to the skin and settles deep in the bones. Dawn would rise over the cornfields, the stalks standing silent and brittle beneath a pale fog that seemed unwilling to lift. Wooden porches creaked under the slow shuffle of boots, yet no one lingered to talk. People kept their eyes low, their words clipped, as if a single careless sentence might summon something they feared. Her name was Margaret, or at least, that is what the oldest among them still dared to whisper. But in the church ledger, where births and baptisms were carefully penned in faded ink, her name had been scratched out so deeply that the paper tore clean through. The blank space was more haunting than any record could have been. Children were told not to ask about her. Strangers were told she had never existed. Yet there was a shadow in every kitchen conversation, a tightening in every gaze when the topic brushed too close. It was said the coroner once had a report, a thin stack of yellowed pages that described in cold detail what had happened to her body. But one morning, the drawer where it had been kept was found unlocked, the papers gone, and no one claimed to have seen them since. There were rumors, always whispered and never confirmed, of 3 doctors, each approached at different times, who refused to lay a hand on her. Not because they could not help, but because they would not. Their reasons were left unsaid, their eyes fixed on the floor, their mouths a hard, pale line. In a town where a broken arm or fever was met with immediate care, this silence was louder than any diagnosis. If you walk past the old fields today, you might still see the weathered frame of what was once her family's home. The shutters hang loose, knocking softly in the wind. The boards sag, as though the weight of what happened inside still presses down upon them. Some say that on certain mornings, when the fog rolls low and the sun is slow to rise, you can hear faint knocking from within, though the house has been empty for generations. Others say they've seen a figure at the window, still as glass, watching the road. No one knows for certain when Margaret's life began to unravel, but the way the town recoils from her story even now makes you wonder if the truth was too monstrous to speak or too sacred to betray. Somewhere buried under years of dust and fear, the real story waits, and it begins with a name the town tried to erase. It was found folded in half, its paper brittle, the ink faded to a brown whisper. A letter dated November 1823, addressed from Lancaster to a name that had been smudged beyond reading. It spoke in neat, deliberate handwriting of an urgent request, one that had pulled a young physician from his rounds and sent him riding hard toward a lonely homestead miles outside the village. He wrote of the cold that morning, of how the frost clung to the fields like a shroud, and of the silence that hung over the road as he approached. Yet his words falter when he reaches the moment he stepped inside. He does not describe the room, nor the light, nor the face of the woman he had been called to see. Instead, the line falls into something darker. I remained only minutes. I departed in haste. Not an ailment I can cure, not one I can name. It was the first real trace of Margaret's story to surface in nearly 2 centuries, a scrap of her life pulled from the dust. But its power lay not in what it said, rather in what it refused to say. The physician had left no medical notes, no list of symptoms, no prescription. Only that short, broken phrase that seemed to tremble on the edge of understanding. His diary, discovered alongside the letter, was no more generous. A single entry, written the same day. The eyes did not look upon me, yet I felt seen. I will not return. Historians have turned these words over and over, trying to pry meaning from the gaps. Was it a sickness that defied the medicine of the day, or something so far from illness that the language of science could not touch it? Some accounts hint at a figure in the corner of the room, not speaking, not moving, yet somehow the source of every unease. Others speak of a sound, a steady, low murmur that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The contradictions only deepen the mystery. And then there are the details no one can agree on. Some say Margaret was lying in bed, pale and frail, her hands folded as though in prayer. Others insist she was standing when the doctor arrived, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the far wall, as though watching something no one else could see. In each version, however, the physician leaves within minutes, his coat still on, his hat clutched in his hand. He does not wait to be paid. He does not look back. The letter offers no answers, only an image of a man fleeing a place he had been desperate to reach. It is a doorway, cracked open just enough to glimpse the shadow beyond. Whatever he saw in that room, it was not something he could cure, and not something he dared to name. The winter of 1823 settled over the township like a slow, smothering blanket, yet it was not the cold that kept people indoors. Doors were bolted early, lamps extinguished before their oil was spent. In the archives there are quiet gaps in the church records, weeks where Sunday gatherings were cancelled without explanation. Meeting notes end mid-sentence, as if the pen had been lifted in haste. Farmers' ledgers speak of livestock found lifeless in the fields, no wounds upon them, only a stillness that did not belong to sleep. Those who lived through it would later speak, in guarded tones, of a phrase whispered from porch to porch, the girl who listens at night. No one would explain it plainly. Some said she could hear things not meant for human ears, the thoughts of those around her, the voices of the departed, the steady crawl of something moving just out of sight. Others said it was not hearing at all, but a kind of knowing, as though nothing within a mile of her home could remain secret. People swore she would speak of things before they happened. Her words soft, almost apologetic, yet never wrong. And when her name passed between neighbors, it came with a glance over the shoulder, a pause to be sure the road was empty. Local historians described the fear as a kind of contagion, not of the body but of the mind. They believed the town began to fear itself, each neighbor watching the next for signs of whatever had taken Margaret. Families kept their children inside. Chores once shared in the open were done behind closed gates. Even the sound of footsteps after dark could stir unease, for it was said she walked the fields at night, listening for something only she could hear. The silence around her was not born of kindness, nor of respect. It was a wall the town built together, brick by whispered brick, until the truth was sealed away where it could not be touched. Yet the more they refused to speak her name, the more her presence seemed to grow, pressing in on the edges of every conversation. By spring, the town had returned to its routines, but the quiet remained. It was in the way people crossed the street to avoid certain windows, in the sudden stops of their stories, in the wait that lingered after laughter. Margaret's name was gone from every record, yet she was everywhere, woven into the hush that the town prayed would never be broken. The first physician came on a pale morning, the kind where the sun seemed to hesitate just below the horizon. His account, preserved only in a few fragile pages, tells of a narrow room that smelled faintly of damp earth and candle smoke. Margaret sat upright in her bed, her back straight, her hands resting loosely in her lap. Her eyes were fixed on something beyond the far wall, as if the wooden boards were no more than a veil, and she could see straight through to whatever lay behind. She did not turn her head when he entered. She did not acknowledge his greeting. Instead, her lips moved in a slow, steady rhythm, murmuring words he could not place. The syllables slid past him like water over stone, fluid and precise, yet belonging to no language he recognized. He wrote of how the air in the room seemed thick, almost weighted, as though each breath came slower than the one before. Daylight filtered through the small window, yet it offered no comfort. He could not explain why the light appeared dimmer the longer he stayed, or why the corners of the room seemed to stretch away from him, as if they were receding into some unseen depth. Then came the other sensation, sharp and sudden, a certainty that he was not alone with her, that something stood just behind her shoulder, close enough to breathe against her hair, though the space was empty to the eye. He tried to step closer, but his own body resisted. His pulse quickened, his hand tightening on the strap of his bag. He asked her name, but the murmuring did not stop. He tried to touch her wrist, to feel her pulse, Yet the closer his fingers came, the more certain he became that he should not. There was no clear reason for this certainty, only the deep, primal conviction that contact would be a mistake. In his notes, there is no mention of diagnosis, no attempt at remedy, only the moment he stepped back, closing his bag without opening it, and said, quietly, almost apologetically, that he could not help her. He did not meet her eyes. He did not look toward the space where he felt the presence linger. By the time he left the house, the murmuring had stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, it seemed to press against his ears. In later years, when asked about the visit, he would not speak her name. He would only say that there are things medicine cannot touch, and that some rooms are not meant to be entered twice. The second doctor arrived in the heat of June, the dust of the road clinging to his boots, and the brim of his hat damp with sweat. He carried a small case of remedies in one hand, a worn leather Bible in the other. Those who saw him that morning recall his brisk pace, the air of a man convinced he was walking into a common case of female nerves. He expected sighs and fainting spells, perhaps a fit of tears that could be soothed with smelling salts and gentle words from Scripture. But the moment he stepped across the threshold, his confidence began to falter. He would later describe the air inside as colder than any winter room he had ever known. It was a biting, unnatural chill that settled deep in his chest, despite the sunlight spilling hot and bright outside. Margaret sat where she had been found before, upright, hands resting loosely, eyes locked on nothing. Yet when she spoke, the voice that filled the room did not match her face. It was lower, measured, carrying a strange resonance that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. The words were not his language, nor any he could place, though they rose and fell with the cadence of speech. He tried to read from his Bible, but the moment he began, she stopped speaking altogether. Her gaze turned toward him, slow and deliberate, as if she had only just noticed his presence. He later swore that the silence in that moment was worse than the voice. It was too complete, like the air had been pulled from the room. He felt something brush the back of his neck, and his fingers trembled as he fumbled for the smelling salts. The vial slipped once before he could grip it. He did not unstop it. Eyewitnesses outside saw him emerge only minutes later, his face drained of color, his Bible clutched so tightly that his knuckles blanched. One neighbor recalled how he stumbled into the street without a word, crossing himself again and again, as if afraid the act might lose its strength if he stopped. He walked past his waiting horse and did not return for it until sundown. When pressed for details, he gave none. Only a muttered line, repeated more than once in the weeks that followed, the coldest room in Ohio in the middle of June, and a voice, but not her own. From that day forward, he never again accepted a patient from that part of the township. He was the oldest and most trusted physician in the county, a man who had set bones on the roadside in driving rain, who had held cholera patients through their final hours without flinching. When he came to Margaret's door, it was with the calm of someone who believed he had already seen the worst a human body could endure. He carried his instruments in a polished wooden case, the hinges oiled, the latches bright, and the quiet assurance of decades behind him. Neighbors felt certain that if anyone could help her, it would be him. The account of what happened inside comes only from his own writings, discovered years later in a chest with a false bottom, hidden beneath old tax receipts and brittle medical notes. In the first lines, his words are measured, almost clinical. He describes Margaret sitting in a narrow bed beneath a single, low window. Light fell across her face, but seemed to slide away from her eyes, leaving them in shadow. She did not move when he approached, nor when he spoke her name. Her skin was warm to the touch, her pulse steady. By every measure, she was alive and well. And yet he wrote, something was wrong in a way no instrument could measure. He could not shake the feeling that she was watching him without moving her eyes, that the awareness in the room did not belong entirely to her. The longer he stood at her side, the heavier the air seemed to grow, until every breath felt like it cost him something. Then came the moment he stopped writing in sentences. His words break into short, uneven lines, as though he was trying to write faster than his own thoughts. 10 minutes after stepping inside, he closed his case without using a single tool. He rose, excused himself quietly, and left the room without looking back. His bag remained behind, resting on the chair where he had placed it. That evening, without explanation, he packed his belongings, locked the doors to his practice, and within the week had moved 2 towns away. In the hidden papers, alongside his hurried notes, are page after page of frantic sketches. Each is of Margaret's face, drawn over and over, as if his hand could not stop. In every one, her eyes are darkened with thick charcoal, the black so heavy it tears the paper in places. Not a single sketch shows them open, as though to draw them would mean seeing them again, as though seeing them once had been more than enough. Gallows Road wound its way out of town like a ribbon of dust, narrowing with each turn until the trees pressed close on either side. Locals still speak of its name in hushed tones, recalling how, during the Revolutionary War, a wooden scaffold had stood at its far end, the noose swaying in the wind above a crowd of silent onlookers. When the war ended, the gallows were torn down, but the land did not lose its weight. Beneath the weeds and nettles lay the bones of the unclaimed, men buried without ceremony in shallow graves no one bothered to mark. Over time the earth swallowed the scars, and in 1802 a modest timber house was raised there. That house would one day belong to Margaret's family. From the outside, it was an unremarkable structure. A steep roof, a stone chimney, and narrow windows that let in little light. But those who had reason to step inside told of a stillness that clung to its walls, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The floorboards groaned in long, tired sighs, and no matter how the family patched or nailed them, the creak returned. At night, it was said, the boards would stir on their own, a slow, deliberate pacing that moved from the front hall to the kitchen, then up the narrow stairs. Sometimes it would stop outside a bedroom door, and remain there, the silence more unsettling than the sound. Margaret's room was at the end of the upper hall, a small square space with a single window overlooking the fields. Her family avoided it whenever possible. They claimed the air inside was colder than the rest of the house, even in the high heat of July, and that the smell of damp earth lingered there no matter how many times the linens were washed. At night, her door was kept closed, not to keep her in, but to keep something else out, or perhaps to keep it contained. Old records suggest the foundation of the house had been laid directly over part of the burial ground. Bones were found once during repairs to the root cellar, though the family buried them again quietly, without telling the pastor. Some believe Margaret's illness, if it could be called that, was not an illness at all, but a binding, a thread between her and what lay beneath the floor. Even now, those who walk Gallows Road say the air changes as you near where the house once stood. The wind stills, the trees seem to lean in, and if you stand quietly enough, you might hear it, the faint, patient creak of footsteps on boards that rotted away long ago. It began as a whisper between neighbors, passed across fences and over the tops of market baskets. Someone had seen a man standing outside Margaret's window in the dead of night, his face pale in the moonlight, his posture too still to be mistaken for someone merely passing by. Soon, others claimed they had seen the same, though when the details were compared, they never matched. One described a stranger in a long, dark coat, his hat pulled low over his brow. Another insisted it was a woman in a faded bonnet, her hands clasped before her as if in prayer. And then there were those who swore the figures had no faces at all, just smooth shadows where their features should have been. What they all agreed upon was the hour, deep past midnight, when the fields were silvered by frost and the rest of the house slept. The figures never moved, never knocked, never called her name. They simply stood beneath her narrow window, their heads tilted slightly upward, as if listening for something within. Some witnesses claimed they would vanish the moment anyone drew too close, melting back into the fog or dissolving into the dark like mist in the wind. Others said they would turn and walk away, their steps slow and deliberate, their shapes fading into the tree line. For weeks the sightings continued. Sometimes one figure, sometimes two or three, spaced evenly apart, as if standing watch. No one could say if they were strangers from beyond the township or something older, tied to the land itself. The more superstitious believed they were guardians, keeping vigil over Margaret for reasons no living soul could understand. Others feared they were there for the opposite reason, not to protect her, but to keep her from leaving her room. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The last report came on a night when the air was thick with the smell of rain, and Margaret's condition had worsened so sharply that her family sent for the pastor. A neighbor swore she saw three shapes standing together by the window that night, their heads bowed, their bodies unmoving. By morning, Margaret could no longer speak, and no watcher was ever seen again. Whether they had been keeping her safe or keeping her prisoner remains a question no one dares to answer. But sometimes, on certain nights, neighbors say the air near that empty patch of land feels expectant, as though someone, or something, is still waiting. Before the whispers, before the refusals, before her name was torn from the records, Margaret was known as one of the brightest lights in the township. She worked behind the counter of her father's small general store, where the scent of coffee beans and lamp oil clung to the wooden shelves. Customers remembered her quick smile, the way she would recommend a particular cloth or book, as though she had chosen it just for them. She could read and write as well as any man in town, a skill her father encouraged, and in the quiet hours between customers, she would sit by the front window with a book open on her lap, sunlight catching in her hair. Letters from those years, faded and creased from handling, speak of her curiosity about the world beyond Ohio. She asked after cities she had never seen, ships she had only read about, and the customs of people she would likely never meet. In one letter to a cousin, she described her wish to see the ocean, at least once in her life, if only to be certain it is as endless as they say. Her words were confident, tinged with a humor that made her feel alive, even now on the page. She was engaged to a traveling book salesman named Henry, a man whose work took him across the state and beyond. They met when he stopped in the store to sell a collection of sermons bound in dark leather. He later admitted it was not the sale, but her sharp questions about the author that made him linger. Their correspondence survives in fragments, his neat, deliberate script answering her lively hand. In one letter he promised to take her to Lancaster to see a rare book auction. In another he teased her for finishing a volume he had not yet read. There is no mention of illness, no shadow of fear. Those who knew her then describe a young woman who walked quickly, spoke clearly, and seemed entirely at ease in her own skin. She sang while she worked, small snatches of hymns or folk tunes that carried into the street. If she had any secrets, they were no darker than the private dreams of a life she had not yet lived. It is this image, the Margaret who laughed behind the store counter, who pressed flowers between the pages of borrowed books, who planned to see the ocean, that makes the later accounts so hard to reconcile. How could the bright-eyed girl in the letters become the silent figure the doctors would not touch? Somewhere between those two lives lies the truth, and it has never been found. The night it began, the storm came without warning. Heavy clouds rolled over the fields in a matter of minutes, swallowing the last light of day. Rain fell in hard, slanting sheets, rattling the shutters and drumming against the roof. Thunder shook the walls, and the wind howled through the gaps in the eaves. When the storm finally broke, Margaret was gone from her bed. They found her outside, barefoot in the mud, her nightdress plastered to her skin, standing at the edge of the yard. Her hair clung in wet strands across her face, and her eyes were locked on the black shape of the woods beyond the field. She did not turn when her father called her name. She did not shiver in the chill. She only lowered her head slightly, as if listening to something deep among the trees. From that night forward, She began to change. She stopped eating, pushing away bread and broth alike, her once bright frame thinning in a matter of weeks. Her voice, when she spoke at all, would sometimes shift in tone and timbre, sounding older or lower or strangely doubled, as if two people spoke at once. And every night, without fail, she woke at exactly 3:07 a.m. The family heard her moving in her room, the creak of the bed, the shuffle of her feet on the floorboards. Sometimes there would be murmuring, other times a soft, deliberate tapping against the wall. No matter how they tried, she would not say what woke her. Her father sought help first from the doctor in town, then from the church. Both visits ended in the same way, with polite refusals that turned to firm rejections when her name was spoken. The pastor sent them away with a brief prayer, his eyes fixed on the ground. The doctor closed his door without explanation. Even neighbors who once visited often now kept their distance, crossing the street rather than pass the house. The family tried on their own. Warm baths, whispered prayers, reading from the Bible at her bedside. None of it changed the pattern. She would sleep until that precise moment each night, wake, and begin again. By August, her face had grown pale and drawn, her gaze fixed more often on nothing at all. Yet there were moments when she would smile faintly at the empty air, as though greeting someone just beyond the reach of sight. Whatever had come for her that stormy night did not leave. It marked the hour, and kept it, returning again and again until it claimed something in her no one could give back. By the turn of autumn, the family had taken to locking Margaret's door at night. They said it was for her safety, though no one ever explained from what. The narrow brass key would turn with a dull click after sunset, and her footsteps could be heard crossing the floor as she moved about the room. The window at the far wall overlooked the yard and the road beyond, and it was from there, neighbors said, the sound would come. It began as a soft, irregular tapping, barely audible over the rustle of leaves. But soon the pattern became clear, not random at all, but arranged in short and long sequences, like a message meant for someone listening closely. The rhythm would change from night to night, as if a conversation were unfolding in code. Those who heard it said the sound came from inside the glass, not from a branch or the wind. One evening, a cousin from the next town over volunteered to stay in the room with her. He was a strong, broad-shouldered man, certain whatever troubled her could be reasoned with or guarded against. The door was locked from the outside once both were inside, and for a time all seemed quiet, but sometime after midnight the tapping began. What happened next was never written down, only pieced together from what little the cousin would admit. The family heard hurried footsteps in the hall well before dawn, followed by frantic knocking on their own bedroom door. When they opened it, they found him pale and shaking, his coat thrown over one arm, his eyes darting toward the stairs as though expecting something to follow. He did not speak a word on the way out, and by sunrise his horse was gone from the yard. When pressed later, he only said he would not go back into that room, not for family, not for money, not for God himself. He refused to explain, though some claimed they saw marks on his hands, faint and narrow, like scratches made in the dark. The tapping continued for weeks afterward, always at the same window, always in those strange, deliberate patterns. No one ever decoded them, and when the sound finally stopped, the silence it left behind felt heavier than the noise had ever been. It was as if the conversation had ended, but the listener remained. Margaret's mother kept the family Bible on her nightstand, its leather worn smooth from years of handling, the pages soft with use. It had been in the family for 2 generations, its margins filled with careful notes and dates marking births, marriages, and deaths. Every night she would read by lamplight, her lips moving silently over familiar verses, as though the words themselves could keep the darkness at bay. But one autumn morning, the Bible was found in a state no one could explain. It lay open on the floor beside the bed, its spine cracked, several pages torn clean from the binding. The verses on certain pages had been violently scratched out, the ink gouged into deep scars in the paper. Across the leather cover, crude symbols had been carved with something sharp, jagged shapes that did not belong to any language the family knew. The air in the room carried the faint smell of burnt oil, though the lamp had not been lit since the night before. Her mother swore she had left the book untouched when she went to sleep. She woke only once in the night, to what she thought was the sound of whispering in the hall. When she rose to check, the house was still, the doors locked, the windows latched. Yet by morning, the Bible was ruined. The family carried it to the local minister, a quiet man with kind eyes who had baptized Margaret years before. He examined the damage in silence, his fingertips tracing the carved symbols as though testing their edges. After a long pause, he closed the book and told them he would keep it for study, to determine what might be done. They say his hands trembled slightly as he took it. He was seen leaving town that same week, his small carriage loaded with a single trunk. No sermon was given, no notice left for the congregation. He never returned. In the years that followed, no one claimed to know where he had gone, though one farmer swore he saw him on the road south, the Bible resting on the seat beside him, wrapped in a strip of plain cloth. Superstition spread quickly after his departure. Some said the markings were a form of curse, meant to strip the book of its protection. Others whispered it was the book itself that had been used against someone, and that destroying it was the only way to break its hold. Whatever the truth, the family never replaced it. The empty space on the nightstand remained, a hollow where scripture had once stood, and where some nights Margaret's mother swore she could still smell burnt oil. The meeting was held on a cold evening in late November, long after the lamps in most homes had been put out. Only a handful of men and women were summoned, each arriving by back lanes or across darkened fields, so their gathering would not be noticed. They met in the back room of the old grain store, where the walls smelled of dust and the air was heavy with the faint scent of burlap. A single lantern burned on the table, its light low and unsteady, casting their faces into shifting shadow. The minutes from that night, preserved in a private archive for nearly 2 centuries, read in a clipped, uneasy hand. No formal introductions, no prayers. They began at once with Margaret's name, though even here, it is written only once before being replaced by the word subject. The first entries record concerns about the effect her condition was having on the town, the livestock deaths, the cancelled gatherings, the growing reluctance of anyone to pass her family's home. Then came the arguments. Some spoke of the old sickness, a phrase whose meaning is never explained in the text, but is repeated with a kind of fearful familiarity. To them, Margaret was a victim of something the town had seen before, though not in living memory. Others insisted she was not the afflicted, but the source, that whatever had taken hold of her could spread, not through touch or breath, but by some other, older means. The discussion turned to the matter of aid. It was noted that 3 doctors had already refused her, and that further requests for help would bring unwanted attention from outside the township. One by one, the voices around the table agreed that no more attempts should be made. The phrase used in the minutes is stark: let no hand be offered. By the close of the meeting, the lantern was burning low. They signed their names in silence, the ink pooling in uneven strokes on the rough paper. The record ends without a conclusion, only a final note that the family would be left to their own course. When the participants left, they did so without speaking, scattering into the night like shadows dispersing at dawn. No announcement was ever made, but in the weeks that followed, it became clear to everyone in town that a line had been drawn, and that Margaret now stood on the other side of it, alone. The night of August 12th began without incident. The heat of the day had given way to a close, heavy darkness, the air thick enough to press against the skin. By midnight, the road was silent, save for the low hum of crickets in the fields. Then came the first scream, sharp, high, and so sudden it startled dogs into barking as far as the town square. Within moments, the sound rose again, raw and desperate, carrying through the night air for half a mile. Those who heard it would later say it was not the cry of someone in pain, but of someone being pulled from themselves. A handful of neighbors stepped out into the road, straining toward the direction of the Gallows Road house. From the upstairs window of Margaret's room came sudden flashes of light, not the steady glow of a lantern, but quick, unnatural bursts, white and searing, as though lightning had found its way indoors. With each flash, the scream seemed to twist, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, as if more than one voice were crying out at once. Then came the smell. It drifted on the wind, reaching the road and the yards beyond, a sharp, metallic tang, undercut with something scorched. One farmer compared it to copper left too long over flame. Another swore it was the scent of blood. Whatever it was, it turned the air thick in the throat. Inside the house, chaos reigned. The family rushed to Margaret's door, finding it locked as it had been every night for months. Her father struck it with his shoulder until the latch gave way. What happened in the moments after remains unclear, pieced together only from fragments. There is mention of movement in the room, though not of Margaret herself. A shadow, they said, where it should not have been. A sudden gust of air, though the window was shut. When the noise stopped, it was not with a fading cry, but with the kind of silence that falls like a weight. They found her father lying in the hallway just beyond the doorway, his body limp, his breathing shallow. On his forearm was a mark the size of a man's hand, but the fingers were too long, the span too wide, the edges too sharply defined. Margaret was in her bed, her face turned toward the wall, her eyes open but unfocused. She did not speak, did not react when touched. Outside, the smell of burnt copper lingered long after the window went dark, as if the night itself had been scorched. It happened without warning. One morning, Margaret's bed was empty. The covers lay smooth, as though she had simply risen and dressed herself, though no one had heard her door open in the night. The lock was still bolted from the inside. Her shoes remained neatly placed by the wall. There were no footprints in the dust of the hallway, no scuff marks on the stairs, no sign of forced entry. Everything was in its place except for the window, open by barely an inch, though it had been nailed shut the evening before. The nails lay on the sill, bent slightly, as if eased out with care rather than pulled in haste. Her mother swore she had checked the room just after dawn, finding it empty but undisturbed. Her father, still pale from the events of August, staggered through the house calling her name until his voice broke. Neighbors were summoned, and soon the yard filled with men and women scanning the fields, eyes drawn again and again to the dark line of the woods beyond. Some claimed they saw her that morning, though none could agree on the details. One farmer said he spotted her from a distance, walking barefoot along the tree line, her hair loose and tangled, her white night dress trailing in the dew. A girl in town swore she saw two figures in the early fog, one Margaret's size, the other taller, moving beside her without touching. And there were those who whispered she had been carried, lifted in silence by something that left no trace on the ground. The search began at once. Men combed the woods in lines, calling her name until their voices cracked. Lanterns were carried along the banks of the creek, their light flickering across the black water. For weeks, the search stretched into every hollow and abandoned barn, every mile of fence and field, but she was never found, not officially. A handful of searchers spoke later, in quiet moments, of things they had glimpsed. A pale shape just ahead in the trees that vanished when approached, a low rustling that kept pace with them, though the branches were still. One man claimed he found a single scrap of white cloth, snagged on a thorn, damp and cold, as though pulled from water. When the search was finally called off, the house on Gallows Road stood with its windows shuttered, the upstairs room left empty. The open window was nailed shut once more, though some say, on certain nights, the nails would be found lying on the sill again. It was early spring when the river gave up its only offering. The thaw had come late that year, and the Ohio ran high and fast, carrying with it branches, uprooted weeds, and the occasional carcass of winter's toll. A fisherman from upriver spotted something pale, caught against a piece of driftwood near the bank. At first he thought it no more than a scrap of linen, but when he pulled it free, he recognized the fabric, fine cotton, white with a faint embroidered edge, the same kind Margaret had worn in the weeks before she vanished. What struck him first was its condition. The river was swollen with silt and debris, yet the cloth was spotless, untouched by mud or algae. The stitching was unfrayed, the threads bright as if newly sewn. More unsettling still, when he held it in his hands, the fabric was warm. Not the fleeting warmth of sunlight, for the day was overcast and the air damp with chill, but a steady heat, as though it had just been pressed to living skin. Word traveled quickly, and within hours a small crowd gathered by the bank. The cloth was passed from hand to hand, each person remarking on its warmth, the way it seemed to hold it no matter how long it was touched. Some said it felt almost like a pulse, faint but certain. Others refused to touch it at all, crossing themselves or muttering prayers under their breath. No one could say how long it had been in the water. If it had been there since Margaret's disappearance months before, it should have been shredded by the current, stained by the river's endless turning. And yet it was perfect, impossibly so, as if it had been kept apart from the world until the moment it was found. The fisherman swore he had seen no one upstream, no boat or figure along the bank who might have dropped it. The driftwood that held it was half sunk, the cloth wound tightly as though it had been placed there, not carried by the current. By evening, the fabric had been taken to the sheriff's office, where it lay folded on a desk. But some claim that when they returned the next day to see it, the warmth was gone. The cotton was cool, limp, and smelled faintly of river water. Whatever had clung to it in that first moment had slipped away, leaving behind only a piece of white cloth, and the question of how it had survived the river untouched. It was more than 40 years after Margaret vanished, when a mason, repairing the crumbling plaster of the old house, struck something hollow behind the upstairs wall. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with fraying twine, was a small leather-bound journal. The handwriting inside belonged to Margaret's younger sister, her neat script bending into shakier lines as the pages went on. The earliest entries are plain observations, notes about Margaret's restlessness, the way she would wake in the night and pace the room. But soon the tone shifts. She writes of watching her sister's body move in ways it should not, her limbs bending too far, her back arching until the joints popped. She describes the sound of her voice changing, sometimes dropping into a low guttural growl, other times lifting into a strange, almost melodic cadence that was not her own. Then came the marks, small at first, faint shapes on Margaret's wrists, and along her collarbone, like the shadows of symbols. As the weeks passed, the sister writes, they grew darker, sharper, appearing in patterns she could not decipher. No matter how she tried to wash them away, they would return by the next night, as if drawn beneath the skin itself. One entry, written in hurried strokes, tells of her drawing a circle of salt around Margaret's bed. She does not explain where she learned to do this, only that the noises from the walls stopped for 3 nights afterward. In another entry, she confesses to waking with dirt under her fingernails and the soles of her feet, though she swears she had not stepped outside in days. Her words carry the weight of someone trying to hold on to reason while feeling it slip away. It is still her face, she writes in one of the final entries, but when she looks at me, I do not know her. She describes the way Margaret's eyes would follow her even in darkness, catching the light like polished stone. The journal ends abruptly. The last page is dated only 2 weeks before Margaret disappeared. It contains a single sentence, written in letters so faint they seem to sink into the paper. They are closer now, and I cannot keep them out. No one knows what became of the sister after Margaret vanished, But the journal remained, sealed away behind the wall, as if it had been hidden, not just from the family, but from whatever might have been reading over her shoulder as she wrote. They came without warning, just as the last snow was melting into the ruts of Gallows Road. 3 men, all dressed in long black coats that brushed the tops of their boots, their collars turned up against the wind. They arrived together on horseback, their mounts dark and restless, breath steaming in the cold night air. No one in town recognized them. They spoke to no one. Their eyes, when they lifted their heads to meet another's gaze, seemed to pass right through, as if the person before them were only half there. Witnesses said they went straight to the house on Gallows Road, their horses' hooves muffled in the damp earth. The men did not knock. They were met at the door by Margaret's father, who stepped out onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him. Whatever was said between them was too quiet to carry beyond the gate, though a neighbor swore she saw her father's shoulders stiffen at something one of the men whispered. After a few minutes, the 3 were admitted into the house. They came at night, and always left before dawn. No one in the family would speak of their visits, though the lamps in the upstairs room burned later on those nights, the curtains drawn tight. Some say the men carried small cases, the kind doctors might use. Others claimed the cases were too narrow, too long, as though meant for instruments not found in any ordinary practice. On their second visit, a boy delivering milk to the house spotted them from the edge of the field. He said they stood at the foot of Margaret's bed, their heads bowed, their lips moving in unison, though no sound could be heard. Margaret lay still, her eyes open, fixed on the ceiling. When the boy's foot slipped in the mud, making a sharp noise, one of the men turned his head toward the window with such suddenness that the boy fled before seeing more. Their third visit came only days before Margaret disappeared. That night, a light flickered in the upstairs window, dimming and flaring as if the flame inside were being drawn and smothered again and again. The men left before sunrise, their coats unbuttoned despite the chill, their expressions unreadable. They did not ride back through town. No one saw which road they took. When Margaret was found missing, some whispered that the men had taken her, carried her away to some distant place where whatever afflicted her could be contained or studied. Others believed they had come too late and had left empty-handed. In the months that followed, the black-coated men were never seen again. Their names were never learned. Yet in the few surviving accounts, one detail is constant. Wherever they went, the air seemed heavier, the silence deeper, as though they had brought a piece of another place with them and left it behind. The ledger was found in the county archives, its leather cover cracked and curling at the edges, the pages smelling faintly of dust and mildew. It was the official record of the coroner's work, neat columns of names, dates and causes of death stretching back decades. Most entries were unremarkable: fever, drowning, accident. But near the end of the 1823 section, there was a gap. A whole page had been torn out, the jagged edge still clinging to the binding. Whoever had done it had pulled hard enough to tear the stitching, leaving the surrounding paper puckered and fragile. On the facing page where the missing entry should have begun, faint traces of ink bled through from whatever had once been written there. The letters were too broken to read in full, but one name was unmistakably longer than the rest. And though the ink had faded, the shape of its first letter matched the way Ms. was formed in other entries of the time. Below it, in the column where causes of death were recorded, there was only a single word incomplete. The handwriting was not the usual steady hand of the coroner, but sharper, as though written quickly or with some strain. No other entry in the ledger used that word. Deaths were often marked unknown or undetermined, but never incomplete. It implied something interrupted, a process that had begun and could not be finished. Archivists believe the missing page was taken deliberately. The tear was too clean to be accidental, too specific to have been caused by decay. And if there had been an investigation into Margaret's case, this ledger might have been the only official trace of it. Without the page, there was no date, no notes, no record of what the coroner had seen. There are whispers in the surviving town letters that the coroner visited the Gallows Roadhouse only once and left looking pale and unsteady, his coat buttoned wrong. One account claims he burned a bundle of papers in his yard that same night, though no one saw what they contained. Why the ledger remained at all, but with her page removed, is a question no one has answered. Perhaps the rest of the book was kept to avoid suspicion, the missing leaf hidden or destroyed. Perhaps someone believed that erasing her from the record would be enough to end the story. But the ragged edge of that torn page remains, catching under the fingers, a quiet reminder that something had once been there, something someone wanted, gone badly enough to risk leaving behind the proof of its absence. By the following spring, the house on Gallows Road stood quiet. The fields lay untended, weeds pushing through the fence posts, and the windows remained shuttered even on warm days. Neighbors noticed the change in small ways at first. Fewer trips into town, curtains drawn earlier, smoke no longer rising from the chimney by morning. Then one day, the family was simply gone. No wagon seen on the road, no farewell given. Their departure was marked only by the absence of their voices and the slow settling of dust. It was weeks before anyone dared to enter. The family had left behind unpaid accounts at the store and several tools borrowed from neighbors. Curiosity eventually overcame hesitation, and a few men went to see if anything could be salvaged. They found the door unlocked, the front room stripped bare, cupboards stood open, shelves empty. The kitchen table was gone, as were the chairs. Even the hearth was cold and swept clean. But when they reached the upstairs hall, they found one door still locked. Margaret's, the same brass keyhole gleamed faintly in the dim light. They forced it open, the latch giving with a groan. Inside the air was stale, the dust thick enough to soften their steps. The bed still stood against the wall, but the mattress and linens had been removed, leaving only the frame. It was then they saw the carvings. Along the length of the wooden headboard, etched deep into the grain, were symbols, jagged, looping shapes, that matched the markings once seen on the cover of the family Bible. They were not haphazard scratches, but deliberate cuts, repeated with precision, as if to form a pattern or ward. The same symbols ran down the bedposts, darkened by something rubbed into the grooves. The room held nothing else. No clothes, no books, no keepsakes. The window was nailed shut, though the wood around it was scored, as if the nails had been pried out and driven back more than once. One of the men later claimed the air inside felt colder than the rest of the house, though the shutters had been closed tight for months. The family's departure was never explained. They did not write, did not send for their belongings, did not settle their debts. Those who asked were met with shrugs or the quiet shake of a head. Over time, the weeds grew taller, the house leaned into its own decay, and the story of the locked room became just another piece of the town's unspoken history. Yet for those who had seen the carvings, the memory lingered. It was not the emptiness of the house that stayed with them, but the sense that whatever had once been contained in that room had not been meant to leave, and that perhaps it hadn't. The first came only months after the family vanished. A farmer walking home at dusk, along a dirt road west of town. He saw her standing in the ditch, barefoot, her white dress hanging loose against her frame. She did not speak, did not move, only watched him with an expression he could not read. When he called out, she stepped back once, and in the space of a blink, she was gone. He searched the ditch, the hedgerow, the open field beyond, but there was no sign of her. The air where she had stood was tinged with a strange, metallic scent, sharp enough to catch in the throat. The sightings continued, scattered across the years and miles. A wagon driver swore he saw her at the bend of a creekside road, her hair unbound and moving in a wind he could not feel. 2 schoolboys claimed she stood in the lane ahead of them. One foggy morning, her bare feet pale against the mud, her head tilted slightly as if listening. They ran before she could move, but when they glanced back, she was already gone. The details shifted with each account. Sometimes her hair was long, sometimes cropped short, sometimes her dress was clean, other times stained dark at the hem. But always she was silent. Always she kept her distance. And always, when approached, she vanished without a sound, leaving nothing behind but the faint, unmistakable smell of burnt copper. Older residents began to treat the reports like weather warnings, passing word in low voices, seen again near the Miller farm or along the Ridge Road. Some believed these were nothing more than stories, fed by the memory of the girl from Gallows Road. Others were not so certain. They pointed out that the sightings spanned decades, long after Margaret should have aged, and yet none described her looking older than the year she vanished. One of the last recorded accounts came from a traveling preacher in the 1870s. He had stopped his wagon at the edge of a wooded trail when he saw her watching from between the trees. He said the air around her seemed heavier, as if the forest itself was holding still. When he took a step toward her, the scent of burnt copper grew strong enough to make his eyes water, and then she was gone, leaving the leaves untouched, the ground unmarked. By then, her name was rarely spoken, even in whispers, yet the image of the silent, barefoot woman lingered on the roads of rural Ohio, as if she still walked them, not searching, not fleeing, but simply waiting. It was a spring storm that finally brought the house down. Years of neglect had left it leaning into the wind, its roof sagging, its walls buckled from rot. When the rain came in sheets and the thunder rolled low over the fields, the structure gave way. By morning, it was no more than a heap of wet timbers and stone. The chimney toppled, the floors splintered into the mud. Neighbors who came to see the ruin found the air thick with the smell of rain-soaked earth, and something older, deeper, the scent of wood that had not seen daylight in a lifetime. As they picked through the wreckage, they found the remnants of rooms barely recognizable. But in what had once been Margaret's bedroom, the collapse had torn open a section of floor, revealing a square of wood darker than the boards around it. A trap door, its edges worn smooth with age, lay half covered in debris. When pried open, it revealed a narrow shaft leading into the ground, the air rising from it cold and stale. The space below was small, no higher than a man's shoulders, its dirt walls reinforced in places with stone. Scattered across the packed earth were bones, some clearly animal, others not so easily identified. Among them were fragments of cloth, long rotted, and the rusted outline of what might once have been a chain. Word spread quickly, and before long, the sheriff and a few others came to examine the find. They carried the bones out one by one, laying them in the grass. The smaller ones, chicken, rabbit, perhaps dog, were set aside without much discussion. But the larger remains drew longer silences. A skull, weathered and discolored, was turned over in the sheriff's hands. No one could say for certain whether it was Margaret's. There was no sign of her hair, no trace of the embroidered cotton she had been last seen wearing. The storm had scattered the timbers so thoroughly that no clear picture could be formed of how long the trapdoor had been there, or what it had been used for. Some whispered it was a hiding place, meant to keep her contained when the locked door upstairs was not enough. Others believed it had been there long before the house, part of the land's older, darker history. By evening the bones were taken away, the trapdoor left open to the cooling air. Rainwater pooled in the hollow overnight, and by morning, the space had begun to collapse in on itself, as if the earth was ready to swallow it back. 2 centuries have passed, and still the story resists its ending. Margaret's name has been erased from ledgers, her likeness never captured in any surviving portrait, yet her presence lingers, in the records with missing pages, in the half-remembered accounts passed down between generations, and in the hush that falls whenever her story begins. The events of 1823 on Gallows Road sit at the crossroads of folklore and fact, a place where official history thins and something older bleeds through. Historians trace the fragments, the scratched-out church records, the torn page from the coroner's ledger, the family's sudden departure west. Each artifact tells part of the truth, yet none explain the whole. Paranormal investigators point to the sightings, the symbols, the unexplainable details, a cloth that stayed warm in a rushing river, voices that did not belong to the body speaking them, a room colder than the winter air outside. Skeptics argue for sickness, hysteria, or the distorting lens of memory, yet even they cannot account for the one detail all sources agree upon: the refusal of 3 experienced doctors, each walking away from her bedside without so much as lifting a hand to treat her. It is this fact, more than any whispered tale, that keeps the case alive. Men who had faced cholera, battlefield wounds, and the slow wasting of fever could not, or would not, name what they saw. Their silence remains one of the few immovable stones in a shifting story. In the quiet corners of rural Ohio, the memory of Margaret's fate is still told, though never in full and rarely in daylight. Some speak of her as a victim, others as a vessel, and a few as something caught between. There are those who believe she never left the township at all, that the barefoot woman glimpsed on lonely roads is not an echo, but the same figure who stood in the upstairs room 200 years ago, untouched by time. Folklore has its own gravity, pulling details toward it, reshaping them to fit the needs of each telling. But here, in the space between the verifiable and the impossible, the edges remain jagged. Too much has been hidden, and too much has survived. So the story persists, alive in the silence it leaves behind. And for those who still walk the overgrown stretch where Gallows Road once lay, there is the lingering sense that some doors once closed do not stay that way. Somewhere in the unsettled dark of history, Margaret's case waits, not to be solved, but to be found again.